I knew something was wrong the moment I saw that smug, over-perfumed menace, Brenda Laughton, standing on my lawn with a clipboard in her manicured claws. Brenda, the HOA president, had the kind of smile that made you check your wallet after shaking her hand. And right now, she was looking at my property like a wolf eyeing a fattened lamb. I stepped out onto my porch, arms crossed. "Brenda," I said, keeping my voice even, "something I can help you with." Her red lips curled upward as she adjusted her floral scarf, the same one she wore every time she was about to screw someone over. "Xander, darling," she cooed, flipping through her clipboard. "I wanted to discuss something rather exciting. The HOA is making some adjustments to the neighborhood, and we've decided to repurpose unused lots to improve the community." I raised an eyebrow. "Unused?" She gestured around like she was showing off a model home. "Well, your property is underutilized. The board has decided that it would be better off as a green space, a nice little park, maybe a gazebo." I felt my jaw tighten. "Brenda, I live here. That lot is mine." She made a tusk-tusk sound. "Oh, Xander, you didn't pay your voluntary HOA fees for the past 2 years. That means we had to take action. The board voted last week to annex it for community use. We've already found a buyer interested in developing it into something beautiful." My blood ran cold. "You're selling my land." She gave a delicate shrug, as if I had just asked if it was going to rain tomorrow. "It's all legal, dear. You should have read the fine print when you moved in. You wouldn't believe how many homeowners overlook these little details." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my hands from balling into fists. "I never signed up for your HOA." She gave a breathy laugh like I had just told the cutest joke. "Oh, Xander, that's the funny thing about bylaws. They change." I stared at her, my mind racing. They had to be bluffing. No way could they just take my land. But Brenda's smug confidence told me otherwise. They had manipulated something, twisted some rule, and now they thought they had me cornered. I glanced at the clipboard she clutched so tightly. That was my first mistake. Because she followed my gaze and pulled it closer to her chest. "I'd love to stay and chat, but I have a meeting with the buyer in an hour. Just wanted to give you a heads up before we move forward." With that, she turned on her heel and strutted off down the sidewalk, leaving me standing in my own yard, completely blindsided. But if Brenda thought I was going to roll over and let the HOA steal my land, she had another thing coming. Because I wasn't just going to stop them, I was going to destroy them. The moment Brenda disappeared down the street, I marched straight into my house and pulled out every document I had on my property. I wasn't about to let some self-important HOA president steal what was mine. If they thought they could bully me into submission, they had no idea what they were up against. I spread the paperwork across my kitchen table, flipping through purchase agreements, zoning records, and any legal documents tied to my land. I had bought this property outright years ago, and I had never signed a single HOA agreement. There was no way they had any legal claim over it, but I needed proof. Digging deeper, I accessed the county records online and searched for any changes in the neighborhood zoning laws. It didn't take long before I found something that made my blood boil. 3 months ago, the HOA had filed an amendment with the county, attempting to retroactively place several properties, including mine, under their jurisdiction. They had used a loophole, citing a rarely enforced ordinance that allowed HOAs to absorb properties that were adjacent and unregulated if they could prove it benefited the greater community. That was their angle. They had slipped this change past the county office, probably bribed someone to look the other way, and now they were trying to strong-arm me into compliance. I wasn't the only one targeted either. A few other properties on my street were listed under the same amendment. If this went unchecked, Brenda and her cronies would be able to seize multiple lots under the guise of community improvement. I needed a plan, and I needed it fast. The first thing I did was call the county clerk's office. After a frustrating half-hour of being transferred between departments, I finally got through to someone who actually knew what they were talking about. The woman on the other end, a no-nonsense administrator named Carol, was more than happy to help when I explained what was going on. She confirmed my suspicions the HOA had filed the amendment without notifying the affected homeowners. That was illegal. By law, they were supposed to send written notices and get homeowner approval before making any changes that affected private property. That was my opening. I thanked Carol and hung up before pulling out my phone and making another call, this time to an old friend, Daniel, who just happened to be a real estate attorney. Daniel listened patiently as I laid everything out for him. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. "They really think they can pull this off," he said. "That's bold and completely illegal." I asked him what my options were. "First, we stop them from selling anything," he said. "You need to file an injunction immediately. That'll put everything on hold while we sort this out legally. Second, we dig into the HOA's financials. If they're pulling something this shady, odds are they've done worse." I liked where this was going. Daniel promised to get the paperwork rolling, and I decided it was time to gather some allies. If I was going to take on the HOA, I wasn't going to do it alone. I spent the next few hours visiting my neighbors, the ones who were also listed on the HOA's little land grab. Most of them had no idea what was happening. The HOA had been banking on people not paying attention, and for the most part, they had been right. But once I explained the situation, people got angry. By the end of the day, I had a small but determined group of homeowners ready to fight back. We pooled our resources and agreed to let Daniel represent us. Whatever the HOA was planning, we were going to make sure it blew up in their faces. The next morning, Daniel filed the injunction, effectively freezing all HOA property transactions until further notice. That meant Brenda's little meeting with the buyer was going to be a complete waste of time. But I wasn't satisfied with just stopping them. I wanted to turn the tables. So while Daniel handled the legal side, I started digging into the HOA's finances. With Carol's help, I got my hands on some public records that showed how the HOA had been handling money over the past few years. What I found made my jaw drop. The board had been mismanaging funds for years, funneling money into consulting fees paid to companies that didn't exist, approving absurdly high salaries for themselves, and even using HOA funds to pay for personal vacations. This was more than just a land grab. This was fraud. Armed with this information, I called a meeting with my group and laid everything out for them. The anger in the room was palpable. Some of these people had been forced to pay outrageous fines for minor infractions, like having the wrong type of mailbox, while Brenda and her cronies had been siphoning money for their own benefit. We had enough evidence to blow this whole thing open, but I wasn't done yet. If the HOA was struggling financially, that meant they were likely desperate for cash. And desperate people made mistakes. So I came up with a way to not only take them down, but to take everything from them. Over the next few weeks, while Daniel worked on the legal battle, I quietly started buying up properties in the neighborhood. Not just any properties, ones linked to the HOA board members. See, Brenda and the other board members had been so focused on squeezing money out of homeowners that they hadn't noticed their own properties were vulnerable. A few of them had taken out massive loans against their homes, probably assuming they'd be able to cover them with HOA profits. But with the injunction in place and their shady dealings under investigation, they were running out of options. I played the long game, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And then, when the time was right, I made my move. One by one, I bought up properties connected to the HOA board members directly or through intermediaries, until I had enough leverage to do exactly what I had planned from the start. I was going to evict them from their own neighborhood. By the time the HOA caught wind of what was happening, it was too late. Their financial mismanagement had left them vulnerable, and with the injunction in place, their usual shady tactics were useless. Brenda and the other board members had been so busy plotting their next scam that they hadn't noticed the ground shifting beneath them. I had spent weeks working quietly behind the scenes, acquiring properties linked to the HOA board members through intermediaries. I had to be careful. If they realized what I was doing too soon, they might have tried to sabotage the deals. But greed blinded them. They were too focused on their failing land grab to notice the walls closing in. Brenda was the first to crack. One evening, I was reviewing legal documents in my home office when I got a call from Daniel. He had been keeping an eye on the HOA's financial situation, and the news was exactly what I had been waiting for. Brenda had defaulted on a major loan. She had been using HOA funds to cover personal expenses for years, and with the legal scrutiny we had brought down on them, she could no longer dip into the HOA's accounts. The bank had started foreclosure proceedings on her house, and she was scrambling to find a way out. I didn't give her one. Instead, I made sure that when her house went up for auction, it was bought by one of my associates, who then immediately served her with an eviction notice. Brenda had spent years bullying homeowners, slapping them with ridiculous fines, and seizing properties under bogus HOA rules. Now she was on the receiving end of her own tactics. When she realized who was behind it, she stormed up to my doorstep, her usual arrogance replaced with barely concealed desperation. Her voice wavered as she demanded to know how I had done it. I didn't bother explaining. She had dug her own grave. I simply told her that what she had done to others had finally come back around. There was no appeal process, no emergency HOA meeting that could undo what had happened. She was out, just like all the homeowners she had tormented over the years. She tried to threaten legal action, but without HOA funds to back her, she had no leverage. The moment she realized she had truly lost, she turned and walked away, her usual confidence shattered. But Brenda was just the beginning. One by one, the other board members fell. They had all tied themselves too closely to the corrupt system they had created, and when it collapsed, it took them with it. The treasurer, who had been quietly siphoning money into fake maintenance projects, found himself unable to cover his debts. His house went up for sale within weeks, and I made sure it landed in the hands of someone who had suffered under his ridiculous fines. The secretary, who had pushed through the fraudulent annexation paperwork, tried to go into hiding, but legal action forced her to face the consequences. She had been so confident in her ability to manipulate HOA rules that she never anticipated the possibility of real legal repercussions. When the county launched an investigation into her role in the fraudulent filings, she had no choice but to leave town. Each board member had thought they were untouchable, that they could twist regulations to suit their greed, and that homeowners would simply accept it. They had built their power on manipulation and intimidation, never expecting someone to fight back with strategy and patience. But I didn't just want them gone, I wanted the entire corrupt system dismantled. With Brenda and her cronies ousted, I turned my attention to the HOA itself. The community was more than ready to see it fall. The financial records we had uncovered showed years of fraud, and with the board members removed, we had the votes to dissolve the HOA entirely. At the final meeting, I stood before the remaining homeowners and laid everything out. How the board had stolen from them, how they had attempted to seize private property, and how they had used their positions for personal gain. There was no opposition. The homeowners who had once been afraid to speak out now saw the truth. The vote was unanimous. The HOA was officially disbanded. The neighborhood was finally free. As I walked out of the meeting, I saw Brenda standing near the entrance, watching as everything she had built crumbled. She didn't say a word. She just turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. With the HOA gone, the neighborhood changed. People no longer had to live in fear of arbitrary fines or sudden rule changes. Homeowners started working together, improving the community without the need for a corrupt governing body. And as for me, I finally got to enjoy my land, the land they had tried to steal. I built a garden, planted trees, and installed a small patio where I could sit and take in the view. The lot they had wanted to turn into a park for their own profit, it became a symbol of their failure. And every time I looked at it, I was reminded of one thing. No matter how powerful or untouchable someone might seem, they can always be taken down. All it takes is patience, strategy, and the right kind of justice. With the HOA dissolved and its corrupt leadership removed, the neighborhood took on a new energy. People who had once lived in fear of arbitrary fines and sudden rule changes now felt a sense of relief. Without the constant interference of power-hungry board members, homeowners finally had the freedom to manage their own properties without scrutiny. The first few weeks after the HOA's downfall were filled with small but noticeable changes. Residents repainted their homes in colors they actually liked rather than dull neutrals approved by a committee. Gardens flourished, no longer subject to ridiculous height restrictions on hedges. Driveways that had once been ticketed for barely visible cracks were repaired without the threat of fines. The neighborhood, once weighed down by oppressive regulations, was breathing again. Despite all this, I knew there were still loose ends to tie up. The legal process was still unfolding, and I had no intention of letting any of the former board members escape responsibility. Brenda might have lost her house, but she still had contacts in local real estate circles. If she managed to worm her way into another HOA position somewhere else, she could easily start her schemes all over again. I spent days gathering every document, every piece of financial evidence, and every testimony from homeowners who had been wronged. With Daniel's help, we compiled a case so airtight that even the most expensive lawyer wouldn't be able to wriggle them out of it. Then came the press. A local news outlet had caught wind of the scandal and was eager to cover the story. Daniel and I met with a reporter at a small coffee shop downtown, bringing along a few homeowners who had been directly affected by the HOA's fraudulent dealings. The reporter, a sharp-eyed woman named Lisa, listened intently as we laid everything out: the illegal annexation attempt, the embezzlement, the harassment tactics. She took meticulous notes, occasionally asking for specific dates and documents to verify our claims. When we were finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "This is bigger than just your neighborhood," she said. "If they use these tactics here, there's a good chance they've done it elsewhere." That was exactly what I had suspected. Brenda and her crew had been too confident, too rehearsed in their deception. This wasn't the first time they had manipulated homeowners, and it wouldn't be the last unless we made sure they were held accountable. Lisa promised to publish an exposé that would not only bring their actions to light, but also encourage homeowners in other communities to come forward if they had experienced similar treatment. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. The article went viral locally, spreading across homeowner forums and social media pages. People from other neighborhoods started sharing their own horror stories about corrupt HOAs, and pretty soon, a full-blown investigation was underway. Brenda, who had been trying to quietly disappear, found herself at the center of the storm. Her name was plastered across every major news outlet in the county, and the pressure from public outrage forced local officials to take action. She was arrested on charges of fraud and embezzlement, along with several other former board members. One by one, they faced the consequences of their greed. With the HOA out of the picture, the neighborhood formed a homeowner committee, not a governing body, but a group of volunteers who helped coordinate community projects. Instead of enforcing ridiculous regulations, they focused on real improvements: repairing sidewalks, organizing local events, and ensuring that no one was ever forced out of their home by corrupt leadership again. I watched from my porch as neighbors came together, transforming the community into something better than it had ever been under the HOA's rule. It was over. And this time, the victory belonged to the people, not those who had tried to control them. With Brenda and the rest of the corrupt board facing legal consequences, the neighborhood was finally free from their grip. But cleaning up the mess they left behind wasn't going to be simple. The damage they had done stretched beyond just the fraudulent land grab and embezzlement. They had left a financial disaster in their wake, and someone had to pick up the pieces. The HOA's remaining bank accounts were frozen due to the ongoing investigation, meaning that any pending maintenance projects were now in limbo. Sidewalk repairs, streetlight replacements, and even basic landscaping had been neglected for months, and the funds that were supposed to cover them had disappeared into the board's pockets. The neighborhood was in better spirits, but the infrastructure itself was crumbling. It didn't take long for the residents to realize that, without the HOA, there was no official entity responsible for funding these repairs. But unlike before, when the board used threats and fines to control everything, the homeowners decided to take matters into their own hands. A few of us met at the community park, one of the few areas that hadn't been completely neglected under Brenda's rule. The air was filled with the sound of neighbors talking, a stark contrast to the tense, silent meetings that had been forced upon us in the past. People actually wanted to be here now. A retired contractor named Bill, who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone, pulled out a folder filled with estimates and repair costs he had put together. He explained that, while the HOA had collected thousands in fees every year, much of it had vanished into bogus expenses. If we wanted to fix the neighborhood, we would have to do it ourselves. Instead of forcing mandatory dues like the HOA had, we set up a voluntary fund. Anyone who wanted to contribute could do so, and every penny would go directly into community projects. Bill offered to oversee the repairs himself, ensuring that no money would be wasted on inflated costs like before. To our surprise, people were eager to pitch in not just financially, but with their own skills. A few electricians volunteered to fix the streetlights for free. A group of landscapers who had been stiffed by the HOA in the past agreed to help restore the overgrown parks at a fraction of the cost. Even teenagers in the neighborhood got involved, offering to paint fences and clean up public areas. It was a complete turnaround from the way things had been before. Instead of the community being ruled by a handful of corrupt board members, it was now run by the people who actually lived there. While the neighborhood was coming together, I was still keeping an eye on what was happening with the former board members. The legal process was moving faster than I expected, and with the amount of evidence we had gathered against them, there was little room for them to escape justice. Brenda, in particular, was in deep trouble. The fraud charges alone carried serious penalties, but it was the embezzlement that truly sealed her fate. When forensic accountants started digging into the HOA's financial records, they uncovered even more violations, some going back nearly a decade. She had been using HOA funds to pay off personal debts, finance luxury vacations, and even invest in shady real estate deals that had collapsed. The sheer scale of it was staggering. As the case against her built up, I managed to track down the so-called buyer she had lined up for my lot. It turned out to be a developer with a long history of working with corrupt HOAs, someone who specialized in snatching up properties at a fraction of their value and flipping them for massive profits. Without Brenda's backing, the deal fell apart. And when I confronted him with the evidence of what she had been trying to pull, he backed off completely, not wanting to get caught up in the legal mess. With the fraudulent sale dead, I finally had full, undisputed control over my land. But I wasn't finished yet. There was still one final piece of justice that needed to be delivered. Brenda had spent years manipulating homeowners, threatening them with lawsuits and driving people out of their own properties. Now, it was her turn to experience what it felt like to be truly powerless. Through a little bit of digging, I found out that after losing her home, she had been forced to move into a small rental apartment on the outskirts of town. It was a far cry from the lavish house she had once owned, and from what I heard, she was struggling to keep up with even the basic expenses. I wasn't the type to kick someone when they were already down, but I did make sure that every person she had wronged knew exactly where she had ended up. The same homeowners she had bullied, fined, and harassed now had the satisfaction of seeing her reduced to nothing. Some of them even paid her a visit not to gloat, but to remind her of the damage she had caused. A few left copies of the newspaper article detailing her crimes on her doorstep. Others simply walked past her building, making sure she saw the faces of the people she had once tried to control. She had spent years building her power on fear and intimidation. Now, she had none left. With the former board scattered and the HOA officially dissolved, the neighborhood continued to flourish. The voluntary fund grew faster than anyone expected, and within a few months, we had repaired more than the HOA had managed to do in years. The best part? No one missed the old system. There were no more absurd fines, no more threats of foreclosure, and no more secret meetings where a handful of people decided the fate of everyone else. Instead, we had a community that actually worked together, something the HOA had never been able to accomplish. As I stood on my newly restored lot, watching the sun set over a neighborhood that had finally been freed from corruption, I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. Because in the end, justice wasn't just about winning. It was about making sure no one like Brenda ever had the chance to do this again. Now that the HOA was dead and buried, the neighborhood continued to transform in ways no one had expected. Without the board dictating every detail, people took ownership of their homes in a way they never had before. Yards were no longer sterile patches of grass maintained to an arbitrary standard kids played outside. Gardens flourished, and neighbors actually talked to each other rather than whispering complaints about who had left their trash cans out too long. But while the external changes were obvious, there was still unfinished business lurking beneath the surface. Brenda and her cronies had left behind a tangled mess of legal and financial debris that needed to be cleared away before the community could truly move on. The county investigation into the fraudulent annexation attempt had expanded beyond just our neighborhood. It turned out Brenda had been involved in similar schemes before, using her connections to manipulate property laws and bleed homeowners dry. When the authorities realized the extent of her misconduct, they opened a broader probe into the network of developers and officials she had worked with. That was when the subpoenas started rolling in. One morning, I was sipping coffee on my porch when I spotted a familiar car pulling up to what used to be Brenda's house, the one I had orchestrated the purchase of. A man in a dark suit stepped out, holding a thick manila folder under his arm. He knocked on the door and waited, glancing around as if expecting someone to bolt at any moment. The door opened slightly, and a woman peered out, one of the former board members who had tried to slip away unnoticed after the HOA collapsed. She had been the one responsible for drafting the fraudulent annexation paperwork, thinking she could rewrite property lines to suit her agenda. Now, she looked pale as she took the documents from the man in the suit. Legal trouble was finally catching up to all of them. Brenda, of course, had been the centerpiece of it all, but the rest of the former board members weren't going to escape unscathed. With the investigation widening, each of them was being pulled into the legal storm, forced to answer for the years of shady dealings they had overseen. Meanwhile, I had been focusing on securing the neighborhood's future. The voluntary fund we had set up for community improvements had grown faster than expected, thanks to residents eager to distance themselves from the HOA's era of control. One of the final projects on our list was restoring the old community center. It had been neglected for years, its budget siphoned away into Brenda's personal accounts. Under her rule, it had become a ghost building locked up, falling apart, and used only as a front for funneling money into bogus renovation costs. Now, with real funds and honest oversight, we finally had the chance to fix it. Bill, the retired contractor who had stepped up after the HOA's downfall, led the effort. Volunteers showed up in droves, eager to undo the damage the HOA had left behind. Walls were patched, the roof was repaired, and the interior was completely revamped. By the time the work was finished, the building looked better than it had in decades. Instead of being an empty shell used for financial scams, it was now a gathering place for the community. The grand reopening was marked by a neighborhood celebration, something Brenda would have never allowed under her reign of rules and fines. People brought food, kids played in the newly restored park, and for the first time in years, the community felt whole again. As I stood by the entrance, watching the transformation unfold, Daniel approached. He had been following the legal proceedings closely and had just come from a court hearing regarding the former board's fate. He didn't need to say anything right away. The satisfied look on his face said enough. It was over. Brenda had taken a plea deal, agreeing to testify against the developers and officials she had worked with in exchange for a reduced sentence. The others weren't so lucky. Some were facing heavy fines, while others were dealing with lawsuits from homeowners who had suffered under their corrupt rule. The power they once held had crumbled completely. With the last of the legal battles wrapping up, I turned my attention back to what really mattered moving forward. The neighborhood was no longer just a collection of houses under the thumb of a corrupt HOA. It was a community, built on trust rather than fear. People had learned to rely on each other, to solve problems together instead of waiting for some self-appointed authority to dictate how things should be done. As the evening wound down and people began heading home, I took one last walk through the neighborhood. The streetlights, once neglected, now shone brightly. The sidewalks, once cracked and uneven, had been repaired. The homes, once subject to suffocating regulations, now reflected the personalities of the people who lived in them. Brenda and her HOA had tried to take my land, believing they could manipulate the system to their advantage. Instead, they had lost everything. And in their absence, the neighborhood had finally become what it was always meant to be: free.